Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Hands Where I Can See Them, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by FlyingBlueBirds, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt. Hands Where I Can See Them. Chapter 20. The final piece of the puzzle. Tally arrived at her apartment quite early the next morning. She carefully opened the door and quietly padded through the hallway, attempting to make as little noise as possible, which turned out to be a real challenge. Sarah had really managed to wear her out last night, in the best way possible. Tally could feel her skin prickling when she thought about the feeling of Sarah's hands roaming over her body. When she was with her, her whole body seemed to be overly sensitive, responsive even to the smallest of Sarah's touches. She had never experienced something like this. Had never experienced pleasure like this. Still, after spending the whole night at Sarah's place, her whole body was feeling sore. Her muscles hurt as if she had just completed a full-body workout, which actually wasn't even that far from the truth. She tried her best to carefully navigate her body through the hallway, calculating each and every step, but couldn't stop herself from flinching and had to bite her lips several times to suppress a pained groan after making a wrong movement. It had been worth it, though. Oh, it definitely had been. And she couldn't wait to do it again. In fact, Tally would have loved nothing more than to stay at Sarah's place for the rest of the day. But no matter how hard she was trying to deny it, after yesterday's emotional roller coaster ride and the unplanned night away from home, Tally really needed a shower, a change of clothes, and some rest. And with Sarah around, especially the latter, would be almost impossible. So, Tally had decided to be an adult for once and had headed home for a while to get some sleep before her shift started. She was, however, not so keen on running into Raelle and Abigail, or rather on an interrogation that would surely follow this encounter. And that was why she was currently sneaking through her own apartment like a burglar. When she opened the door to the kitchen, she quickly realized that unfortunately all of her efforts had been completely fruitless. She huffed quietly when she spotted Raelle and Abigail sitting at the table, having breakfast. Damn you, early morning shifts. Both were holding a mug of coffee in their hands and were smiling at Tally so innocently that she knew it could only mean one thing: trouble. Good morning, sunshine, Abigail greeted her sweetly. Fancy seeing you here at that time of day. Please, can we just not do this right now? Tally groaned. But Raelle was already playfully wriggling her eyebrows, and the smug grin on Abigail's face spoke volumes. Oh, we're so doing this right now. I hate you. You love us, Raelle stated plainly. Then her eyes wandered up and down Tally's body like she was examining one of her patients. So let me just list the facts quickly. 1. You haven't been home all night and look like you haven't gotten any sleep at all. 2. You are still wearing yesterday's clothes. 3. These bruises on your neck look like you've either been choked badly or someone's teeth left quite an impressive mark there. Or maybe a little bit of both. Abigail! Tally blushed and hid her face in her hands, which told Raelle and Abigail everything they needed to know and, of course, only fueled their teasing. Kinky, Raelle grinned. Anyway, now that we've covered the basics, what has the accused to say in her defense? Wait, I kind of missed the point where I committed a crime. Well, we kind of missed the point where you started sleeping with someone, Abigail continued to tease her in a pretendedly taunting voice. Tally only crossed her arms in front of her body and rolled her eyes, determined not to get into this any further. Abigail and Rael, however, wouldn't back down. Instead, they took Tally's silence as a sign to continue their interrogation more forcefully and fired question after question in Tally's direction. "It's Alder, isn't it? When did this happen? How did this happen? Are you two a thing now? Is she good in bed? Oh, I bet she is. I mean, with those long fingers?" That comment was the last straw, which finally made Tally cave in. She exhaled loudly, then raised her hands in defeat. "Fine, fine. Goddess, you two are the worst," she snapped, but then couldn't really hold up her angry facade when a small smile spread over her face as she recalled just how exactly she had spent her last night. "Yes, I was with Alder. The second night in a row, actually. And that's all you're getting on that matter because it's absolutely none of your business. I'm exhausted and in desperate need of a shower, and my bed." Then, before Abigail and Rael could ask for any more juicy details, Tally turned on her heels and hurried out of the room, back in the hallway, now full-on grinning. She turned around one last time, not quite able to resist the temptation, and yelled in the direction of the kitchen. "And yes, we had sex. Several times, to be precise, and it was fucking glorious." Literally, though. Sarah was fucking glorious. And oh, Rael had no idea just how right she had been about Sarah's long fingers. But now was not the time to flail about Sarah. Quickly, Tally fled into the bathroom, before Rael and Abigail could come after her. She managed to reach the room without further inconvenience, but could still hear their loud cheers, long after she had closed the door behind her. When Tally entered the police department several hours later, she felt surprisingly refreshed. It was amazing what a shower and a couple of hours of uninterrupted sleep could do with a person. She was glad that Rael and Abigail had already left for work when her alarm had woken her up. Tally loved them, she truly did, and she would share all of the details with them eventually. But for now, she was happy to keep her and Sarah's new, well, whatever it was they had now, all to herself. This was in fact the one thing that was still bugging her. She wasn't sure what she and Sarah were exactly. They had not really had the time to discuss if they were just a casual thing, or something more. Sarah's words hadn't sounded like she was just a quick fling, but there still was this insecurity that kept nagging at her. Well, Tally definitely knew what she wanted, and just the thought of referring to Sarah as her girlfriend made her heart skip a beat. And technically, there was no problem in making things between them official. The department was not really strict on these kinds of regulations. Sure, there would be a potentially very awkward talk with Captain Bellwether. They would need to fill out a couple of forms, and they would still need to be subtle about their relationship when they were on duty. But that was about it. Since they were both detectives, there was no superiority issue, and they would still be allowed to work together. Tally just hoped this was also what Sarah wanted. Lost in thoughts, she stepped into the elevator, and just when the doors were about to close, someone else rushed inside. Someone Tally had been looking forward to seeing all morning. "Detective Craven?" Sarah's deep voice was immediately sending shivers all over Tally's body, making her forget everything that had occupied her thoughts. "Detective Alder?" Tally replied, just as formally. Then the two women fell silent. Tally watched how Sarah stepped forward and pressed a button on the control panel. The elevator started to move, and Sarah wordlessly moved back to her original space next to Tally. Their bodies weren't quite touching, yet Tally could feel the heat radiating between them, could feel the tension, the invisible pull that seemed to draw her closer to Sarah. Her fingers were twitching, desperate to reach out, desperate to touch. Her eyes found Sarah's, and when Tally darted out her tongue and unconsciously licked over her lower lip, Sarah seemed to be completely mesmerized by the action. Tally watched her eyes darken as she leaned forward slightly. Sarah followed her movement. Their heads moved closer and closer together, without either of the two women really intending this to happen. Their lips were only inches apart, and Tally could already feel Alder's hot breath on her face when the ping of the elevator announced that they had reached their destination, and the sound of the opening doors made them jump apart. Tally heard how Sarah exhaled shakily. Then her hand closed around Tally's wrist, and she was hurrying out of the elevator, dragging Tally along the, fortunately, empty hallway that had Tally learned soon after belonged to an empty office. As soon as the door had fallen shut behind them, Tally's body was pushed against it, and before she could fully register what was happening here, Sarah's lips were hungrily pressed against her own. Tally escaped a surprising yelp, but then she closed her eyes and returned the kiss with just as much eagerness. It had only been hours since she had last seen Sarah, and it was almost scary to see how much her body was already craving her touch. The fact that Sarah seemed to be going through the same struggle was almost enough to make Tally beam with pride. It was Sarah who finally broke the kiss and gave them a much-needed moment to breathe. She pulled back slightly and mustered Tally through clouded eyes. Well, this could become a problem. Tally's eyes grew wide at Sarah's words, but the older woman was quick to reassure Tally when she noticed how dubious her words had sounded. Relax, Tally. I didn't mean that we could become a problem. Just the fact that whenever I see you, I want to grab you and drag you into the next room to do some very unprofessional things to you. Well, Tally definitely wasn't opposed to that sort of a problem. Still, her thoughts from earlier were crossing her mind again and made her hesitate. She lowered her gaze and exhaled loudly, suddenly self-conscious. Almost immediately, Sarah's hands were on her face, sensing her distress. She carefully lifted up her chin, then moved on to gently caress her cheeks. What's on your mind, Tally? It's just, Tally murmured, slightly scared of the answer she might receive. What are we, Sarah? We are whatever you want us to be. Sarah looked at Tally in a way that was so warm and open that Tally was sure her heart would melt. Her breathed reply came without any hesitation. I want us to be everything. Then that's what we will be. Tally smiled and felt relief washing over her. She pulled Sarah closer again, and that slightly teasing tone was back in her voice. Does that mean I can officially call you my girlfriend? I would like that very much, Sarah hummed approvingly, then pressed another quick kiss on Tally's lips. So about that other problem I was talking about. I'm completely at your mercy, Tally teased, then grew a bit more serious again. No, but honestly, just give it a couple of weeks and you will eventually grow tired of all of this. Sarah apparently took Tally's words as a personal attack and gasped in mocking offense. Then she let her hands slowly wander from Tally's face down her body. They paused right on Tally's breasts and almost accidentally brushed over her nipples, teasing her through her shirt. Tally sighed quietly, and at that moment, Sarah's hands grabbed the fabric of her blazer and pulled her in for another deep kiss. This time she let her tongue slip into Tally's mouth, drawing small whimpers from the younger woman. Then Sarah moved her thigh between Tally's legs, effectively pinning her even harder against the door, and leaving her no other option other than to press her hot center against Sarah. At the contact, Tally released a long, sinful moan and started to slowly grind against Sarah's thighs, grateful for the relief it was giving. Sarah chuckled dryly. I don't think I will ever grow tired of this. And with that, she stepped back from Tally, who was immediately missing the contact. Then, as if someone had pushed a button, Sarah's professional work face was back on. Only the teasing glimmer in her eyes remained, making Tally realize that she was in big trouble. Now, Detective Craven, I guess we have a job to do. These reports won't file themselves, and we still have a case to close. And with that, she opened the door so that Tally stumbled forward slightly and vanished into the hallway. Tally remained behind, still slightly dazed, panting, and worst of all, very, very horny. It took Tally a couple of minutes to put herself together enough to comfortably leave the safe space of the office. It had taken all of her self-control not to shove her hand down her pants and get rid of that annoying tension between her legs herself. But in the end, the thought of letting Sarah take care of that mess she had created later that night had won. Instead, she allowed herself a brief moment of triumph, and maybe also a little payback. She quickly let two of her fingers slip below the waistband of her panties and dipped them into the wetness between her legs. Then she took out her phone and typed a message for Sarah. I hate you. She attached a picture of her fingers that even in the dim light of the office were unmistakably glistering with wetness, and hit send before she could overthink her actions. Take that, Sarah Alder. Two can play this game. When she arrived at the bullpen, Sarah was just checking her phone, and for the first time since she had known her, Telly watched how Detective Sarah Alder almost lost all of her composure in public. She inhaled sharply, then let out a gasp that she quickly managed to conceal with a loud cough. Sarah looked up, and when her eyes met Tally's and noticed the smug grin on her face, Tally was almost certain that she would simply grab her again and take her back to that office to take her right there and then. Sadly, though, she didn't. Instead, she managed to pull herself back together far too quickly for Tally's liking. By the time she had finally reached her, Sarah's whole expression was almost back to normal. Only a slight blush on her cheeks remained. But before either of the two could say something, Detective Bataan joined them. She only greeted the two of them with a brief nod, but Tally didn't miss the knowing smirk that crossed her face, because of course Bataan hadn't missed how she coincidentally came from the exact same completely empty room that Sarah had left only minutes ago. For now, however, Bataan for once seemed to have more important issues to discuss than Sarah and Tally's relationship. Kara Brandt keeps singing like a bird, ever since your little encounter yesterday. She seems almost eager to share every single little detail of her messed up life with us. And when I say every little detail, I sadly mean it, Bataan sighed. I've been a detective for more than half of my life. I've been through it all. But I have never seen someone who gets so detailed, so excited and giddy when talking about slitting someone's throat. Please spare us the details. Telly shivered, still not quite able to get that image of Kara Brandt leaning over her, dagger in hand, fully out of her mind. Only because I like you so much, Red. Nicta winked playfully, but then continued in a more serious tone, summarizing what Kara Brandt had shared with her during their interrogation. She's one of these people where everything went wrong pretty much from the beginning. Brandt lost her parents when she was only 12 years old. Her younger brother was all that she had left. At that, Sarah's face darkened, and she let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Now that sounds oddly familiar. Death of parents, a sibling to take care of, irreparable emotional damage, obsessive behavior. Looks like we're not so different after all. Cut the crap, Sarah. Detective Bataan interrupted her immediately. Please tell me you did not just say that, Tally said in the exact same moment, then sent a scolding look Sarah's way that, under different circumstances, would have made her partner very proud. You are nothing like that woman. And no, I'm not letting you argue with me on this. It's the choices that define a person, what they decide to make out of their lives, not what life keeps throwing at them beyond their control. You literally devoted your life to protecting people, saving lives, and ensuring justice, so don't you dare say that you are even remotely like that woman. Telly's words actually managed to shut Sarah up. She opened her mouth and then closed it again, knowing better than to start a discussion with Tally she would surely lose, and instead smiled at her warmly. Tally returned the smile immediately, determined to show Sarah that each and every single one of those words she had just said were completely sincere. It still pained her to see how a woman like Sarah Alder, who was nothing but strong and self-confident on the outside, could be so insecure, so fragile on the inside, and she would do her best to help her to realize that she was so much more than what she gave herself credit for. The sound of Detective Bataan loudly clearing her throat pulled her away from Sarah's intoxicating eyes. Now when you're done eye-fucking each other, I would like to continue, she teased. Just for the record, I completely agree with everything Red has just said, and I think when I'm finished, even you, Sarah, will realize just how different the two of you are. She then continued with her report, and with each of her words, Telly started to understand a little bit more just how fucked up Kara Brandt was. The woman had worked her ass off in college, and had graduated with a business degree top of her class, a classic overachiever. She had gotten married to some rich and low-key popular architect, then divorced only a year later. After that, she had worked in finances for a while, made it to the top of a high-profit concern rather quickly, and had ultimately earned enough money to fulfill her brother his biggest dream, his own bar. They hadn't intended to advertise Fort Salem as a place for queer people. That was something that had developed all on its own, mainly due to the location of the bar. But the concept had worked. It had attracted customers, it had paid the rent, and had gained enough profit that Miss Brand would have been a fool for not rolling with the concept any longer. It had, however, been the beginning of it all. Alban Hurst, Kara Brand's brother, had some issues. So much had been obvious from the first time Tally had seen him. The true extent of his problems, however, was still a bit shocking to hear. Miss Brand had explained how he had been struggling with social interactions ever since he was a little child. He couldn't talk to someone without losing focus, couldn't keep up a conversation, or show compassionate interest in what others had to say. And it had only gotten worse when their parents had died. To Tally, it all sounded like that man would definitely have needed professional help, but his sister preferred taking matters into her own hands. This had led to Hurst being almost completely isolated, the bar his only way for any social contact at all. He had always struggled with women in particular, had been fascinated by them, their hair, their soft skin, their bodies, yet had received nothing but rejection from them. Something he absolutely couldn't deal with. He started to dislike women, kept referring to them as witches, the source of all evil, and kept bringing up stories about the Camarilla, the group of witch hunters. That story had gotten Kara Brand's attention, and she had simply, as she so eloquently put it, found an efficient solution to deal with this issue. At first, she had only wanted to teach the women who had rejected a brother a lesson, but soon she had actually started to enjoy the killing immensely, and had made it more about herself than about him. She had enjoyed the sheer panic on the faces of the women when they realized they would die, had enjoyed watching the life slowly leaving the eyes of her victims, had enjoyed drawing their blood as a little souvenir, had enjoyed setting fire to the bodies and watching the flames slowly take away the beauty of the women, until they were nothing more than burning flesh. It had been her way of bonding with her brother. She had spent hour after hour researching, had practiced how to make precise cuts that would kill, but also cuts that would simply cause terrible pain, would cause screams that had drawn these delightful sounds of joy out of her brother's mouth. There was a moment of silence after Detective Batin had finished. Both Sarah and Tally needed a moment to process the horrors they had just heard. For a moment, Tally felt herself struggling again, like she was about to drift into another panic attack. This time, however, the knowledge that she was safe and that Kara Brand would no longer be able to do this to her or anyone ever again was enough to keep her grounded. Still, there was this tiny nagging voice in her head that told her something didn't fit. Something was off with all of this, but she couldn't quite grasp it just yet. So she decided that for now, it was best to ignore it and focus on the issue at hand. Okay, that was a lot, Tally managed to break the silence, her own voice still a bit uncertain, and Sarah and Detective Batin only nodded in agreement. What is going to happen now? Is the case officially closed? And Brand and her brother will be put away for good? Detective Batin shook her head. It's not quite that easy. We definitely have enough evidence to charge them with the murders. We even found the vials of blood exactly where Brand had told us they would be. Still, we need to head back to her in Hurst's apartment to make sure we haven't missed anything and collect all the potential evidence we can find. This case needs to be ironclad. There's too much at stake. Alder and I can do that. No, I'm afraid we can't, Sarah stated plainly, and Tally blinked at her in confusion. Why? Because my presence is needed elsewhere. Director Silver called the captain this morning, and rumor has it that he wasn't too pleased about the fact that I've prioritized arresting Kara Brand over keeping up our end of the deal and keeping him informed about our investigation at all times. I mean, how could you? Detective Batin jumped in, her voice dripping with sarcasm. It is what it is, Sarah sighed. He has requested my presence at the apartment he's currently staying at. I should brief him about everything I related to the case, especially Kara Brand. And Petra didn't sound like I have any other choice than to go as soon as possible. Tally didn't like this. She didn't like this at all. Director Silver was a walking red flag, and the fact that Sarah was supposed to spend the evening alone with him worried her. But it's not like this man has done anything to truly earn her distrust, other than the fact that he had flirted with her girlfriend several times. She could hardly ask Sarah to skip the meeting and risk severely damaging the relationship between the FBI and the Boston PD, only because her gut told her so. That's why she only shrugged. All right, you gotta do what you gotta do. I guess that leaves you and me, Red. Detective Patan stepped closer and playfully slapped Tally's upper arm, which only made Tally roll her eyes. Come on, you could at least pretend to be excited. Tally actually had to bite back a grin at this. Oh, I'm over the moon. Just admit that it's a joy to work with me. Yeah, I enjoy it almost as much as typing up and filing unsolved cases that lie back 50 years. Tally snorted, then grabbed the car keys from the desk. I'm driving. She sent one last reassuring smile at Sarah and silently mouthed, "See you later," and then she was on her way. You wound me, Red, Detective Patan shouted after her and turned to Sarah, pouting. She wounds me. You better teach her some manners. Oh, I think I've already taught her quite well how to deal with you. Goddess have mercy, you two are definitely a match made in hell, Patan groaned, then was on her way to follow Tally to the car. Just as with everything else about Kara Brand and her brother, their apartment was concerningly unsuspicious. It looked like it had just been meticulously cleaned. There were no used dishes, no clothes lying around, not even dust grains on the counters. Nothing that suggested two people were technically still living at the place. The only personal touch was the photo albums that Tally spotted on a shelf in the living room, carefully hidden behind some books. When she opened them curiously, though, she didn't find vacation pictures of Miss Brand and her brother. She found newspaper articles after newspaper articles. Not of the Camarilla murders, of course. No, they wouldn't have been foolish enough to place such important evidence in a public place like this. It were newspaper articles about Kara Brand. Articles from the tabloids, giving insight into her relationship with her now ex-husband. Articles from finance magazines documenting her career path. Articles from local newspapers that reported about the opening of Fort Salem. Yes, that woman was definitely very self-centered. Most of the articles didn't include any pictures, which Tally knew had already been a big issue when Detective Patan had tried to find out information about Brand. But there was one page that for some reason captured Tally's attention. It was a rather trivial article in a small finance paper. Some investment deal Brand had been involved in that was now already lying 14 years in the past. There was a small image attached, a group of people in expensive-looking suits shaking hands. Nobody Tally recognized. But there, in the back, almost too blurry to notice, Tally spotted the all-too-familiar blonde head of Kara Brand. She was leaning in, whispering something in the ear of a man Tally would recognize anywhere. She froze and opened her mouth in shock when finally that last puzzle piece found its place. She suddenly knew what had bothered her all along, what had made her so wary about Brand's seemingly loose threats in the interrogation room. Kara Brand was definitely a woman of wealth, a woman with connection, that got her almost everywhere. But that didn't explain why she had almost seemed to be entirely in the picture of their investigation. It didn't explain why she had always been one step ahead of them, had been able to escape them for so long. It didn't explain why she had known about Elizabeth, a piece of information Sarah had never publicly shared with anyone, and had been hidden deep inside her file. No, the explanation for all of this was lying right in front of Tally right now. The man in the picture that was secretly whispering with Miss Brand, apparently completely unaware of the camera capturing that moment, was no other than Blanton Silver. Blanton Silver, the director of the FBI, the father of the first victim, the man who was currently completely alone with Sarah, the woman he had developed an obsession with that was definitely even deeper than Tally had feared. Fuck. Tally barely had any recollection of the minutes that had followed. She vaguely remembered dropping the photo album, running out of the room and screaming for Detective Patan. Then they were in the car, driving recklessly through the already dark streets of Boston. During the drive, she tried to explain what she had discovered to Patan, but the adrenaline was pulsating in her ears and she didn't actually hear the words leaving her lips. Patan probably only understood half of it, but she knew that now was no time for questions. The expression of sheer panic on Tally's face had her react on instinct. She had wordlessly jumped into the car beside her, then had called for backup as soon as they had managed to figure out where exactly they were heading. When they had finally reached the apartment complex in which Silver was currently staying, Tally was out of the car before Patan could stop her. Still, the other detective managed to grab her arm and force her to pause for a moment, instead of just bursting into the apartment, completely clueless about what to expect inside. "Craven," Patan urged her to listen, but when Tally showed almost no reaction to her words, her voice grew more insistent. "Tally, for God's sake! We have to wait for backup." "No," Tally shook her head, her eyes wide and beginning to fill with tears. "We can't wait. She's in there. Sarah's in there with him, and he has nothing left to lose." What if they were already too late? What if Sarah could no longer be saved? What if she would be taken from her, just when she had finally found her? Just when they had finally found each other? "Tally, you're not thinking rationally." She knew that. She did. But how could she when the woman she loved was very likely captured only a couple of meters away from her, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it? Except that she could. And so Tally did what Tally did best, doing the exact opposite of what she had been told. She broke free from Batan's tight grasp around her arm and started to run towards the building, towards Sarah. She didn't even hear Detective Patan cursing behind her, didn't even notice how she came after her only seconds later. Tally only slowed down when she reached the front door. She hesitated, pressed her ear against the door, and listened. There was a mumbled sound coming from inside. A voice, definitely male. Definitely not Sarah. Tally felt her heart sinking and forced herself to stop thinking about what this could mean. Then Patan was by her side, and Tally turned around, ready to forcefully push her away if necessary. But Batan's face was determined now, her whole body on alert. She had made her decision. She wouldn't leave Tally alone. Screw the consequences. Screw the rules. The older detective pulled a picklock out of her pocket and silently nodded towards the door. Tally understood immediately and grabbed the equipment. If Sarah was in there, and if she was in fact forcibly held by Silver, they would need to be careful. They couldn't just simply kick in the door and storm the apartment. That would only endanger Sarah further. So Tally leaned forward and quietly picked the lock in a matter of seconds. She pushed the door slightly ajar, then stepped into the dark apartment, her weapon drawn, Patan right behind her. The voice was louder now. It definitely belonged to Silver. Tally followed the sound until she reached a room at the end of the hallway. She could clearly make out the words that were spoken inside now. "You know, it didn't have to end like this, Sarah. I had big plans for us. This is all your fault." "What is my fault? The fact that I have absolutely no desire to sleep with you?" The sound of Sarah's voice, loud, clear, and as sarcastic as ever, made something inside of Tally snap. Sarah was here. Sarah was alive. She could still save her. The relief that spread through her was enough for her to throw all caution to the winds, and she moved forward and into the room. Silver was sitting at a table, his back turned to the door, completely unaware of Tally's presence. Sarah was sitting opposite him, her face twisted in anger and frustration, only lighting up for the briefest of moments when she spotted Tally in the doorway. At the first glance, there was nothing concerning about the scenery, except for the tiny little detail that Sarah's hands were shackled. Her weapon was lying out of reach on the table in front of them, and Silver was pointing his own weapon directly at Sarah's chest. He still hadn't noticed Tally, and continued the conversation with Sarah in that arrogant tone that had made Tally want to slap him since the first time she'd met him. "Oh, this is so much bigger than you sleeping with me, Sarah. I had great plans for us. We would have been unstoppable. I would have given you everything. Now, what exactly would you have given me?" Sarah tried to keep the conversation going, while Tally's mind started to race. If she would just shoot at Silver, the distance was still large enough that the risk of him hearing the shot and firing at Sarah before the bullet would hit him was far too high. She could try and talk to the man, distract him long enough to give Sarah time to grab her weapon, but her hands were shackled, and Silver was not exactly Tally's biggest fan, so he might just fire at her as soon as she spoke up. She looked back at Sarah, hoping that would somehow give her the solution she was searching for. And it did. Or rather, Sarah did, when she let her gaze flicker to Tally's right for the briefest of moments. Tally's eyes landed on the expensive-looking vase that was standing on a small table, and she understood. It was still risky. There was still a chance of Sarah getting hurt, but she wouldn't be able to keep Silver talking forever, so Tally had to make a decision. She breathed out, forced her muscles to relax, and felt the weight of the weapon in her hand. Then she lifted her arm, focusing on the task ahead, seeing her weapon as an extension of her arm, as a part of her, just like Sarah had told her so many weeks ago. And Tally fired. Her shot found its target perfectly. The vase loudly burst into 1,000 pieces, and the sound was enough to make Silver jump in his chair. He spun around, startled by the unexpected noise, now facing Tally and barely having time to comprehend what was happening. Then, Tally was firing again, and once more her bullet hit exactly where Tally intended to, right into Silver's now fully exposed chest. He dropped his weapon, a gurgling sound leaving his mouth, then slumped together in his chair, hands pressed onto the wound, but unable to fix any of the damage that bullet had done. But Tally was already running through the room, to Sarah, her Sarah. Behind her, Detective Batten was probably checking on Silver. Or maybe she wasn't. Tally truly couldn't care less. All she cared about was right here in front of her. She sank to her knees and somehow managed to free Sarah's hand from the handcuffs, with the lockpick that was still in her pocket. Then she was wrapping her arms around her partner, pulling her close, and burying her head in Sarah's dark hair. "Sarah, are you okay? Please tell me you're okay. Did he hurt you?" Tears had started to stream down her face, and she let out a loud sob when she felt Sarah's hand caressing her cheek, wiping some of her tears away. "Shh. I'm all right, Tally. I'm fine. It's over." Sarah gently lifted Tally's head and placed a gentle kiss on her lips, no longer caring who was watching. She was here. They were here, and that was all that mattered. They kept sitting like this for what felt like an eternity, completely wrapped up in each other's arms, savoring this moment of quiet before the chaos of reality would have them back in its grasp. At that moment, they were no longer Sarah Alder, the esteemed detective with the tragic past, and Tally Craven, the ambitious rookie who never knew when to shut up. They were just Sarah and Tally. Sarah, who thought she had lost everything, but in the end found her future. And Tally, who had slowly wounded her way into Sarah's heart, and with that saved her life in more than just one way. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.